Ever get that like nagging feeling like you kind of messed up even when you haven't?
Oh, yeah.
That's guilt, right? And that's what we're diving deep into today, the psychology of guilt.
Okay.
But not just like the surface stuff, you know? We're going deeper into how it gets all tangled up in our thoughts, our everyday actions.
Right.
And get this, we've got this stack of sources, and they're all over the map: philosophy, psychology, the whole shebang.
It's wild the different angles people have on this.
Totally. And the first one jumps right into it, asks the big question, what even is guilt? And it gets real fast. And it's like, have you ever felt, I don't know, just incapable of doing things right, no matter what you do?
Yeah, that feeling of never quite measuring up.
Exactly. Like, whether it's our own expectations or someone else's we've taken on, that feeling, that's often the starting line for a guilt trip, don't you think?
For sure. And this source, it points out how much of that comes from, how we were raised. It's like parents, they mean well, but they can accidentally lay on this pressure to be perfect,
Oh, totally.
Even unspoken expectations. It all sinks in, becomes this like subconscious thing. And then boom, you're dealing with guilt in situations where logically you did nothing wrong.
That is so true. It's like we absorb those messages.
Yeah.
And they stick with us sometimes for years, right?
Yeah.
Before we even realize what's going on. And here's where it gets really interesting, maybe a little out there. This source, it ties guilt straight to our sense of self, to our ego.
Okay, yeah, I've heard that before, but...
What's key, though, isn't just the connection. It's how the ego uses guilt. It's almost like strategic.
What do you mean?
Think of it. The ego, it wants to protect itself, right?
Right.
So we mess up. Instead of facing that discomfort that I was wrong feeling, guilt swoops in. We could say, oh, I feel bad, so I am bad. And poof, the ego's off the hook. Sneaky, right?
That is sneaky. So it's easier to just feel bad than to actually...
take responsibility. Maybe learn from it.
Exactly. We get stuck in that feeling.
Totally. So then how do we do that?
Yeah.
Break free from this guilt-ego tag team.
Well, this next source, it's by Krishnamurti. He digs into this idea of guilt as a habit.
A habit.
Yeah, something we build up over time. Like the more we fixate on feeling guilty, the more isolated we actually become.
It's like that saying, right? Guilt is the gift that keeps on giving.
Right, but not in a good way.
Not at all.
Yeah.
We get so wrapped up in feeling bad that we create this bubble of self-centeredness.
Yeah.
Even when we're trying to be good people. It's like, what?
It's a paradox, for sure, and it often comes from this fear. Deep down, that fear of not being good enough.
Oh, I know that feeling.
Making mistakes. We end up always needing validation, trying to prove our worth, which honestly is exhausting.
It's like this hamster wheel, right?
Okay.
Constantly comparing, looking over our shoulder, worried what everyone else thinks. No wonder we end up feeling guilt.
And Krishnamurti, he's so sharp here. He says that whole need for approval just feeds the ego.
Ugh, it's a loop.
Total loop. Judging ourselves against,
Yeah.
well, perfection, which is impossible.
So if we're trying to get off this crazy merry-go-round, where do we even begin?
He says, shift the focus. Don't look for validation out there. Look inward. Cultivate self-acceptance, self-compassion.
Easier said than done, though, right?
Oh, for sure.
Especially when we've been told our whole lives that guilt equals, like, being a good person.
Yeah, that's ingrained. And that's actually what our next source gets into, how guilt becomes a problem when we try to fix it the wrong ways.
And by wrong ways, you mean?
Well, think about it. From the time we're little, we're often taught to zero in on mistakes, to chase some external measure of success. This source argues that sets us up for a guilt trip because we're constantly being told we're not enough.
It's like we're programmed for failure right out the gate, criticizing ourselves before anyone else gets a chance.
Exactly. And it even asks this question: can you raise a child without passing down these patterns of guilt?
Now, that is a question I would love to unpack further, but we'll have to save that for next time. Don't go anywhere, though. We'll be right back with more on the psychology of guilt after this.
So we were talking about, how the way we're raised can set us up for a lifetime of guilt trips.
Yeah, it's like we learn to crave that perfect scorecard and then
real life happens.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that brings us to a big one, something this next source dives into. Guilt as self-punishment.
Oh, okay. That sounds kind of intense. Self-punishment. How so?
Well, think about it. When you feel guilty, what do?
Oh man, so many things. But usually I dwell, replay the mistakes.
There you go.
Yeah.
Beating ourselves up, right? Focusing on what we should have done different.
Ugh, the worst. But is that really punishment, though?
Because we're holding ourselves hostage to it. to those bad feelings,
Mhm.
guilt calls the shots on our emotions, our thoughts, even how we act.
Wow. Yeah, when you put it like that.
And here's where it gets interesting. This source connects that self-punishment back to the idea of sin. Peccato, they call it.
Hold on, really? So you're saying even if someone's not, like, religious, it's more like those ideas, they seep into our culture, right? Shape how we see ourselves without us realizing it.
Like we're following a script from,
Yeah.
like 1,000 years ago.
Exactly.
Okay, but if we want to rewrite the script, how do we even start?
Well, this next source, it talks about something called the detached observer. Heard of that?
It's one of those phrases I hear, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure I totally get it. Like, what does it mean?
It's about creating space mentally between you and your thoughts and emotions. Instead of getting lost in guilt or shame, whatever it is, you learn to just observe them
Observe.
without judgment. Imagine you're at the movies, right?
Okay, yeah.
Big drama unfolding on screen, maybe even a tragedy. But you, as the viewer, you're not drowning in those emotions,
Mhm.
right? You're experiencing it, but at a remove.
That's a good way to put it. So it's like our thoughts, our feelings, they're actors on a stage, and we can choose. Do we join the play or just watch?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that shift, just that, is huge. Because when we detach from those negative things, they lose their power over us.
Okay, that makes sense. I can see that. But how do we actually do that?
Yeah.
Detach. It's not like flipping a switch, right?
You're right. It takes practice. This source recommends starting small. Mindfulness exercises. Tried meditation at all.
I've attempted it. Not gonna lie, not very consistent.
Even a few minutes focusing on your breath can make a difference. Just feeling that inhale, exhale.
Yeah, but what about when your mind wanders? Which, for me, it always does.
That's natural. The point isn't to shut your brain off, but to notice it wandering and gently bring it back. No judgment.
Like we're training our brains to be more aware of our thoughts, but not get swept away by them.
Exactly. And the more we do it, the easier it becomes to tap into that observer state, in daily life.
So it's literally like building a mental muscle.
Right. And the
Yeah.
benefits, they go way beyond just guilt. Less stress, better focus, overall well-being.
Okay, I like the sound of that. This is starting to feel like a total game changer.
It's a process, for sure, but a worthy one. Speaking of processes, this next source gets into how our need to control things can actually make guilt worse.
Oh, that's interesting. I can see that, though. How so?
Think about it. We feel guilty when we think we've screwed up, right? Like we're responsible for something bad.
Right.
And what's at the root of that? A lot of times, it's wanting to be in control, wanting to believe we can stop bad stuff from happening if we're just better somehow.
Which, let's be honest, is kind of an illusion, right? We can't control everything.
Exactly. And this source says that illusion is what keeps us stuck. Because when things inevitably do go wrong, we blame ourselves.
It's like setting ourselves up for failure before we even begin.
And the solution this source offers, cultivating a sense of surrender.
Ooh, surrender. Okay, that sounds a little scary, like giving up.
It's not about giving up on your goals or anything. It's more about letting go of that need to micromanage everything. Trusting that even if we don't get it, sometimes things happen for a reason.
That is tough, though, especially when everything tells us we gotta hustle, gotta be in control or else.
I hear you. It's definitely a different approach. But this source says that surrender, that's where we find freedom. From the guilt, the shame, all of it. And then we can actually live a life that feels truer.
Okay, I'm listening. But how do you do that? Surrender. When it feels like everything's pushing us the opposite way.
The author suggests starting small. Little, everyday surrenders. Traffic jam got you down. Instead of stressing, put on a good podcast, or just enjoy the quiet for a minute.
Finding those moments to let go rather than needing to control it all.
Exactly. And as we get better at that, it becomes easier to surrender to the big stuff too, the stuff we can't control.
Right.
And just trust that even amidst the chaos, we're right where we're meant to be.
I love that. Surrendering to the journey, trusting the process, having faith that even when it's messy, there's a bigger picture we don't always see.
Beautifully put. And speaking of trusting the process, this next source goes into how our past experiences, especially the tough ones, they can really shape how we experience guilt right now.
So we've been talking about, control, letting go, and how that ties into guilt.
Right. How that desire to control everything can actually make us feel more guilty in the long run.
Totally.
Wow.
And this next source, it gets into something, kind of personal, I think. It's about how our past, especially the stuff that hurt, can still be driving those guilt trips today.
It's like we carry those old wounds around, and sometimes they get poked and prodded without us even realizing it.
This source calls them invisible wounds, which I thought was kind of poetic, you know?
Yeah, I like that.
And it talks about how these unresolved experiences, those emotional scars, they're like a filter we see the world through. And that filter, it can really mess with our perception, make us see things that aren't really there, or at least not in the same way.
Right, confirming our own biases even when they're negative.
Exactly. So like, let's say you've been rejected a lot in the past.
Yeah.
Right? Romantically, whatever.
Yeah, I've been there.
So then, a new relationship, totally different circumstances.
Whew.
But that old wound, it can flare up. And suddenly, you're feeling all that guilt and shame from before, even if it doesn't fit the situation.
It's like you're almost haunted by the past in a way.
Yes. It's like we're time travelers, but not in a cool way, you know? Stuck reliving the same hurt over and over.
Right, right. But this source says it doesn't have to be that way. We can actually heal those old wounds.
Okay, how? Asking for a friend.
They say it starts with just like noticing it, awareness,
Okay.
catching those patterns as they happen. Like, hold on, is this really about this current situation, or am I hearing echoes of something else?
Bringing it into the light instead of letting it run the show from the shadows.
Exactly. And then when we understand how the past is coloring things now, we can start to, reframe it, create a new story, one that's kinder, more compassionate.
So it's not about erasing the past. It's about changing how it affects us.
Yeah. And this source is big on self-compassion. Like, we never treat a friend the way we sometimes treat ourselves, right?
Oh, God, no. I'm the worst to myself sometimes.
We're always judging, replaying mistakes like it'll change something.
Holding ourselves hostage to something we can't change, yeah.
This source says, look, we're not our worst moments. We're not defined by that stuff. Everyone makes mistakes. We're all just like works in progress,
I love that. It's very freeing. So it's like every day, every moment even, is a chance to start fresh.
Totally. Choose love over fear, forgiveness over guilt. That's how we move forward.
Okay, I am here for that message. Now, speaking of moving forward, this next source, it's got some really practical tips.
Lay it on me.
They say, start with gratitude.
Oh, I love that. Simple,
But powerful. The author says you can't feel grateful and guilty at the same time. Your brain just doesn't work that way.
It's like a mental reset button, right? Focus on what's good, what you have, instead of the lack.
And it doesn't have to be huge either. A sunny day, a good laugh, even just stretching after you've been cooped up too long. Those little things can shift your whole energy.
And when you're coming from that place, that gratitude vibe.
It's easier to be kind to yourself.
Yeah.
Forgive yourself. Forgive others.
It's like gratitude is the soil where all that good stuff grows.
Okay, I am totally planting my gratitude garden today.
Me too. And you know what? This last source, it brings it all home.
Ooh, do tell.
It says all this internal work, it's got to lead to action. It's not enough to just think nice thoughts, be grateful in your head.
How to walk the walk.
Exactly. And one of the most powerful ways to do that, making amends.
Oh, interesting. Okay, explain.
If we've messed up, hurt someone, even if it was a long time ago, if we can, we should try to make things right.
So it's about taking responsibility, but in a proactive way. I like it.
The source says that act of making amends, even if it's small, it's healing. Neutralizes that guilty energy.
Closes the loop, yeah.
Yeah.
And even if we can't, fully undo the past.
Just doing what we can now. That lets us move on with a clearer heart,
It's a beautiful thing. So as we're wrapping up this deep dive, what's standing out to you? Any big takeaways?
Honestly, it's the self-compassion thing. That was huge. Not denying the guilt, but remembering we're all human, we all mess up, and we all deserve a little grace, especially from ourselves.
It's like we're all just doing our best with what we've got, right?
Yeah.
And when we can accept that about ourselves and each other, flaws and all, that's where the good stuff happens.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, that about does it for this episode of The Deep Dive.
This was a good one. Lots to think about.
Always is.
To all our listeners out there, thank you for coming on this journey with us. Hopefully you're feeling a little lighter, a little more empowered to ditch the guilt and embrace, everything. Until next time, this is The Deep Dive, signing off.